Welcome, listeners, to an extra special bonus episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. This is the podcast where I talk about the science of infectious diseases in pop culture and critique what they did right and what they did wrong. It's still the holiday season as I record this, so I'm going to talk about something that I thought up over the lead up to Christmas and that I've just now, in the post-Christmas limbo, had the time to research and record. I don't know about you folks, but I have a list of holiday films I like to watch every year to help me with the Christmas spirit, and two of them are The Santa Claus and Ernest Saves Christmas. This year, as I was watching, I realized that being Santa is a transmissible condition. And then I started wondering what kind of condition it is, and how it transmits, and who can be infected, and what all the signs and symptoms are, so all of that. So now you get to come with me as I tell you what I found out after I went researching. So both of those movies, The Santa Claus and Ernest, they're currently streaming on Disney Plus in Canada at the time of recording. But you can also rent them, I think, from all the regular services, all the Apple Store, Google Play, all of that.
Name?
Santa Claus.
Name?
Père Noël. Babo Natale. Père Nicole.
Topo Gijo.
I am going to be focusing mainly on the Santa Claus, but I'll dip into Ernest Saves Christmas a little bit towards the last half of the show. If you haven't seen the Santa Claus, Scott Calvin startles Santa on Christmas Eve. Santa falls off Scott's roof and disappears, so Scott puts on the Santa suit to appease his son and finish delivering gifts so that Christmas isn't ruined. Scott doesn't know by doing this he has unknowingly contracted Santa, or what I'm calling Siberian Arctic Northern Thyroid Autoimmunity. Santa is spread by fomites. Now, a fomite can be anything really, but I usually like to think of it as a portable object, something that you can pick up, as opposed to what we would call a surface, like a table or a door handle. So things like your phone or a debit machine, maybe even the handle of a gas station pump, which are gross, and the reason why I always have hand sani with me all the time. So the fomite here would be the Santa suit itself, most likely, maybe to a lesser extent the sleigh and the reins for the reindeer. But the Santa suit was worn immediately previously by the other infected patients, so I think we're going to go with that one. Later in the movie, we find out from Bernard, the head elf, that this is indeed the case.
Means you put on the suit, you're the big guy.
So while Scott was likely infected immediately upon putting on the Santa suit, there is a few months incubation period before the symptoms do begin to appear. After the first Christmas, he goes home and just goes back to his regular life. Sometime in the summer, the year following Scott's infection, he wakes up one morning having had longer than normal beard and facial hair grow overnight and realizing that he's gained a jolly amount of extra Santa weight. Eventually, as it turns to autumn, his hair begins to turn white as the syndrome takes full effect, and then when he shaves his beard and dyes his hair, it immediately changes back to white and fluffy. There are a few different syndromes that we already know about that can cause some of these signs of premature aging. They're all very rare, though, meaning only a few hundred people are known to have them worldwide. The most studied one in children is called Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, or HGPS. Hutchinson and Gilford were the first two guys who described the syndrome. Progeria, so pro means premature or early, and geria is from the Greek word geron, meaning aged, which is the same root word that gave us gerontology, which is the medical discipline that focuses on senior citizens. So HGPS occurs in only 1 out of every, it says 4 to 8 million births. So in Canada, if you generously round our population to 40 million, it's not quite there yet, but that means we would have only 5 to 10 people in the whole country with this. As of 2022, there were only about 400 known children and young adults living with the syndrome worldwide. So actually, if you calculate that out, with 8 billion people on the planet, as there will officially be on New Year's Day, that's about 1 in every 20 million people. Although given that many people live in remote areas or places that don't report openly to the world the health status of their citizens, and people just die of, quote, unknown causes early without finding out why, there might be more than 400 people, but we can't really know for sure. It's estimated that children with HTPS age 10 times as fast as an average child, but it's usually just their body, not their mind, so this is not an M. Night Shyamalan movie. The average lifespan of a person with HTPS is anywhere from 8 to 21 years, usually about 14, I think, before they pass away from something typically found more in people of an older age, like a heart attack, cancer, or a stroke. Now, HTTPS, it's completely random. Honestly, it could happen to anyone. There's nothing that makes it more or less likely to happen to a person. There's no area of the planet where it's more common or certain, like a subpopulation where you find it more likely. It's not. It's just a result of the fact that the enzymes that replicate our DNA make mistakes. So HTTPS is a dominant genetic condition, and I'm sure a lot of you know what that means, but some may not. So generally, you have two alleles or copies of every gene because you have two sets of chromosomes. One comes from each parent, and they have the same genes, just slightly different versions. For a dominant gene to produce its effect, you only need one copy for it to be expressed, so on one of the sets of chromosomes. Because it's so strong, it overpowers the gene from the other set of chromosomes. For recessive traits, you need your two copies of the gene on either set of chromosomes to be the same for the result to show up. With HTTPS, one of your two genes for a protein called a lamin has a mistake in it. Now, lamins are the proteins that hold your nucleus together and form the membrane, sort of like the membrane that keeps an egg yolk separate from the egg white. In HTTPS, the lamins, they don't have the right shape. They don't fit together just quite perfectly. So your nuclear membrane in your cells will break apart more easily, and that causes your cell to die sooner than it normally would. Like, I don't know, if you could pick up an egg and shake it a bit and then crack it open and it was a scrambled egg because the yolk broke apart inside the shell. There are at least, I think, 7 different kinds of lamins, and they each have a slightly different shape. So if one is a little wonky, it can probably hold together for a little while, but it would be delicate and break down at the slightest damage very easily, like trying to shove the wrong piece of a jigsaw puzzle into the space. Now, most cells in your body don't live forever, and eventually almost every cell in your body will die and be replaced. Cells in your intestines replace themselves about once a week. Most of your blood cells last a couple months. Some muscles will last several years as long as you're not a bodybuilder working out all the time. But some cells, like your heart, your eyes, or your brain, they don't get replaced. Once you're fully grown, that's all you get. And if they're damaged, that's just too bad. They don't replace themselves. Even the ones that are replaced, they can't go on doing so forever, unfortunately, because we are not lobsters. So there is a limit to the number of times that stem cells can divide and replace a cell that has died. There is a name for this limit. You may have heard of it. It's called the Hayflick limit. And it is named after Leonard Hayflick, the guy who originally published on the idea back in 1961. Now, the Hayflick limit, it's different for different types of tissues and types of cells, but usually anywhere from 50 to 70 or so divisions-ish. Hayflick, he actually, when he first started talking about this, he got a lot of shit for his ideas because it was opposite to what everyone else thought at the time. They thought that stem cells were forever, and they're not. But we had things like immortalized cell culture and, cultures of cells that would just go on and on forever. And they didn't know that that's a mutation and it's not supposed to be like that. They just thought that that was the way cells were. So aging comes down to the fact that every time a cell divides, it has to make a copy of your chromosomes. And when it does that, the tips of your chromosomes get a little shorter because of the way the replication enzymes have to attach. You can think of it like the enzyme can only replicate what's in front of it, not what's underneath it. And it has to attach to the end of the DNA by at least a few base pairs, right? So when it does that, it can't replicate them. So little by little, the chromosomes get shorter every time it's replicated. We have a lot of extra DNA at the end of our chromosomes to account for this clipping, but once they get short enough that it would start clipping actual genes and DNA that we need, the cell just refuses, it won't go any further, and it won't divide anymore. It's a little more complicated than that, but basically that's the root of aging. Cells that can't divide anymore. Now, there is an equivalent to HTPS in adults, and it is called Werner syndrome. This involves a different gene, and this one is inheritable since people will frequently survive to adulthood and middle age, with their average lifespan being somewhere in the 50s. This one is a lot more common in some areas than others, with about 80% of the worldwide cases being in Japan, and there's another cluster of commonality on the island of Sardinia. In Werner syndrome, there is a mutation in a gene that codes for a DNA helicase, which is an enzyme that has a big job in guiding DNA repair, replication, and transcription in preparation for making proteins. There is a science nerd pickup line that mentions DNA helicase. It goes, "I wish I were DNA helicase so I could unzip your genes." So you have a few different DNA helicases that guide replication and the other processes. But this one in Werner syndrome, from what I read, is mainly focused on DNA repair. Our regular DNA replication, like I've said before, it makes mistakes. It's about 1 in every 100,000 nucleotides. Most of these get repaired by the repair helicases. Sometimes these mistakes are critical and a cell can't survive if they're not repaired. So it gets repaired and the cell is fine, or it doesn't get repaired and maybe it doesn't make a difference. Or maybe the change and the mistake proves to be more beneficial than the previous version, and so the cell survives better. That's basically evolution from first principles. Werner syndrome was originally described in 1904 by Otto Werner, who was a German medical student, and he was treating a group of 4 siblings who all were exhibiting premature aging. So this is a recessive disorder, meaning you have to inherit the non-functional gene from both parents for there to be a problem. Patients who have this generally develop normally until they're about to hit puberty, but then they don't get their pre-pubertal growth spurt and they remain smaller than their peers. And that's almost the only sign of anything being, quote, wrong until the late 20s when they start to develop typical old people things like cataracts. And then, the doctor will look back at the growth thing and think that it's something that sort of makes sense once they figure out what is actually going on. When you hit your 30s, your skin begins to change and get thinner and have trouble healing, but also there's patches where it's thicker and more fibrous. The thickening part is called scleroderma, and it can affect some of your internal tissues as well, not just your epidermis, your outer skin. It can cause stiffness in the joints and poor blood flow to the fingers and toes. Also functions in some types of acid reflux disease and a ton of other issues caused by thick skin and tissue where it shouldn't be thick. Also in your 30s, there will be other typical middle-age conditions like an increase in type 2 diabetes and osteoporosis, which is brittle bones. There's also atherosclerosis, which is thickened and hardened arteries. And of course, another increased risk of cancer and a loss of fertility for everyone. This is also when you start to get thinning and graying hair and hair loss. So what I found was actually kind of strange. That stiffness in the joints can apparently lead to atrophy of the Achilles tendon or some tendons in the elbows, which I don't know the names of, and these can actually cause the limbs to require amputation, which, I feel like that escalated a little quickly. Interestingly, dementia and the loss of mental faculties that is more common with advanced age are not things that people with Werner syndrome or HTPS appear to have an increased risk of. It seems that their minds tend to be perfectly normal for their chronological age. There are a few other reasons why a person might appear to exhibit the signs of premature aging and weight gain that Scott Calvin goes through. Sudden hair whitening is actually common enough in folklore that it's been given the name Marie Antoinette syndrome, because the former French queen was said to have had all her hair turn white on her way to her execution. And also Sir Thomas More, all his hair turned white the night before his execution, which was for refusing to acknowledge Henry VIII as being more powerful than the Pope. You also might know him because he wrote Utopia, which, movie connection side note, was mentioned in Ever After, the Cinderella movie with Drew Barrymore and Angelica Houston. An old-timey French dermatologist in the 1800s said that emotional triggers can cause sudden, immediate hair whitening. He said, quote, "Paroxysms of rage, unexpected and unwelcome news, habitual headache, overindulgence in sexual appetite, and anxiety have all been known to blanch the hair prematurely." Personally, I think that's a debatable use of the word known in that sentence, but who knows what we know today that will be laughed at in 100 years. Also in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a scientist called Eli Metchnikoff. He was and is a very famous immunologist. He's the one who discovered that phagocytosis plays an important role in the innate immune system. Phagocytosis being where your white blood cells engulf or eat foreign bodies like bacteria to destroy them. It's a very important process that keeps you healthy before infections can get out of control. He's called the father of innate immunity for a reason, and he is absolutely foundational to early discoveries about the body's innate defense systems. I heard about him a lot during my undergrad, especially how, he stabbed thorns into a see-through starfish larva, and then he watched the larva's white blood cells try to eat the thorn. That's how he came up with his main theories. It's a bit cruel, but, so was a lot of science in the 1900s and before. He figured all that out, and so yay for that. But also he did hypothesize that the reason why hair turns white as we age is because of what he called pigmentophages, which he thought were tiny little phagocytes that gobbled up all the pigment in your hair and traveled down your hair strand to your skin and deposited the pigment there. Pigmentophages sound cute, but since when we're old, all walking around with white hair and super tan scalps, they, of course, don't exist. There was another guy called Landois in 1866. He thought that hair went white because bubbles got trapped under the surface of hair and altered the way that light traveled through it. It's not the craziest idea. This is what happens to egg whites when you whip them into a meringue, or to sugar when you're candy making, but it doesn't happen to hair. I've actually got a really cool video. There's this candy making shop that I follow on TikTok, and they talk a lot about that, getting the air and stretching the sugar crystals and everything. I will put a link in the show notes if you want to go watch that. It's actually really cool. But in terms of explaining how hair could go white overnight, there's one paper that I've got a link to. It posits what I think is actually a perfectly reasonable, real explanation, the most parsimonious. The simplest explanation is often the right one. And that is that permanent hair dye wasn't invented until 1907. Before that, we just had dark rinses or washable dyes. Things that were used were like chamomile, lead, silver. There was a tea that was made from walnuts and crushed up walnut shells, that kind of stuff. Things that would, go in and make your hair brown or whatever, but then they would wash out right away. So maybe if someone was sentenced to death and then held in a cell even for a short time, they wouldn't have access to their normal hair dyes, which would have had to have been applied every day. In the case of someone rich and famous like Marie Antoinette, they may even have been bathed and washed before their execution, so they could meet their fate pure and innocent as a sacrifice, or some other bullshit like that. I'm not a historian. I'm not a history scientist, so take that with a grain of salt. But the bit about permanent hair dye is true. Nothing magical or whimsical, no fear or a sudden piety, just a lack of access to hair dye. Now, again, for realsies, there are a few vitamin deficiencies that can, over time, cause an increase in white hairs. Namely, low ferritin, which is the protein in your blood that stores iron, and low vitamin B12. So I guess I need to keep taking my iron supplements if I want to hold off on getting any more gray hairs. Now, a diet low in protein can also cause you to not produce enough keratin, and keratin partly makes up hair follicles. So if it breaks down, pigment loss can occur if there's no fresh keratin to replace it. Being low in folic acid can also cause hair, skin, and nail pigment changes. So basically, it's important to just eat a balanced diet or take multivitamins to make sure you're not becoming deficient in any of these things, because they have a whole host of other things that are important for living too, not just having pigmented hair.
Pete, what's happening to me?
What's your diet like?
Milk and cookies.
Really?
But I don't finish all the milk.
So another option is an autoimmune condition called vitiligo. In vitiligo, your T cells, which are supposed to target and kill cells that have been infected with a virus or bacteria, they begin to target the melanocytes that give your skin its color. It shows up as very stark, light patches of the skin and hair, and has been described as a thing as far back as 3,500 years ago in Egypt. It affects about 1% of the world, and there's honestly no further health implications beyond just being white. People with vitiligo, they're otherwise healthy. Like I said, it's not transmissible, it's not contagious, it can't be spread to people by touching them. But it does cause a lot of anxiety because people are assholes and will make mean comments, especially when you're a kid and it happens. Unlike a lot of autoimmune conditions, vitiligo is actually completely reversible with treatment because your body will produce new melanocytes to replace the ones that get destroyed. Unfortunately, this treatment is lifelong since it's not a cure. It doesn't fix the problem. It just treats it so that your melanocytes aren't destroyed. I don't think people should have to get treatment for it. Just stop being assholes to them because they have a loss of pigment. Now, the reason I bring up vitiligo is because there has been a noted association of people with HIV that is progressing to AIDS and an increase of vitiligo causing white patches on the skin and hair. I am going to do HIV and AIDS, I think, probably next season, because there's a lot of movies that have portrayed it, but that's not this episode, and that's all I'm going to mention about it for now. I found it interesting, though, because of the association of vitiligo with a virus, something that is transmissible, while most of the time autoimmune conditions are not infectious. Not everyone who gets HIV is going to develop vitiligo, since autoimmune conditions only develop in people with a genetic predisposition towards them, but HIV seems to trigger something that causes the autoimmunity to begin. Not only that, there's another association, this time between people with vitiligo and with thyroid disorders. Specifically, there is an increased incidence of people with vitiligo having very mild hypothyroidism. Hypo means low, and thyroidism is your thyroid activity, and your thyroid basically controls your metabolism. You can have hyperthyroidism, and you're very skinny and gaunt and have a very active metabolism, or you can have hypothyroidism and have a very low thyroid activity and low metabolism. People with vitiligo are more likely to have hypothyroidism. And one of the main symptoms of hypothyroidism is unexplained weight gain.
Well, I don't know, Scott. You're as healthy as a horse. Yeah. Clydesdale.
So now I bring it all back together. SANTA, Siberian Arctic Northern Thyroid Autoimmunity. This is the disease that I have invented and that I posit is responsible for transmitting the qualities of being Santa from one Santa to another. It's transmitted how? I suggest that it's a retrovirus of some kind, one that doesn't infect your white blood cells or destroy your immune system as in HIV, but one that brings about a sudden onset of vitiligo and hypothyroidism, causing the hair to turn white and for you to gain some jolly extra weight around the midsection. In order to extend Santa's life, because Santa could be hundreds of years old, the virus probably brings along a few extra enzymes to help function in cellular repair and DNA replication. All of these things to keep Santa actually young and vigorous inside, while the vitiligo keeps his hair white and makes him look old on the outside. Oh, but it doesn't end there. There is still one important aspect of being Santa that I haven't mentioned yet. It's Santa's most important job, in fact, and that is knowing who has been naughty and who has been nice.
He's making a list.
Checking it twice. You gotta find out who's naughty or nice.
Before I talk about that, I want to mention one other thing that this could be. Rather than an infectious disease, it could be an infectious belief. Beliefs and ideas can spread through society just like infectious diseases, often a great deal faster and better, especially with social media and internet and everything. My partner actually brought this up when I mentioned that I wanted to do this episode. That's immediately where his mind went. The widespread belief in Santa could be one of these things, which are otherwise known as an incidence of mass hysteria, or something else called folie à deux. I am not a social scientist to talk about these with any great authority, but there have been a number of things, including unexplained diseases throughout history, that we have no idea exactly why they happened, and which some people like to blame on mass hysteria. Some of these are the Salem witch trials, which at times has been blamed on ergot poisoning and other times as mass hysteria. There was the dancing plague of 1518 in France, the trembling disease in 1905 Germany, and there was a laughter epidemic that spread across villages in Tanzania in 1962. There are a lot. I've got notes and links. Folie à deux is a psychiatric condition where delusional or manic beliefs and even hallucinations are shared by two individuals. There are other folies that involve more people, including folie à plusieurs, meaning folie of several. So belief in Santa could maybe be that. In fact, Ernest Saves Christmas exhibits that one quite well. At the start of that movie, the original Santa is coming on a plane to Florida so he can find his successor, who he has already identified as Joe Carruthers, who is a children's TV show host. Santa spends the whole movie trying to convince Joe that he's now Santa and that he has to take over the job before Christmas Eve or Christmas will be ruined. Santa has to convince everyone else too, because if people don't believe in Santa, he doesn't have any magic or power. You can see that in Elf. Santa is a social construct, like countries, religion, time, or gender. They don't exist if we don't believe in them. At the end of Ernest Saves Christmas, Joe finally does accept that he is the new Santa, and in that moment he shakes Santa's hand and transforms. Everyone believes in him, and then he magically has the power to control the weather and make it snow. As an autoimmune condition, Santa wouldn't be able to take effect immediately like this, so I'll say my theory still needs a little bit of research and testing, but it's like any hypothesis. You gotta start somewhere. So now back to Santa's ability to know who is naughty and who is nice. I recently read a book called How to Stop Time by Matt Haig. It's a delightful book, and I love him as an author. And this one, How to Stop Time, is about people that exist within our society that age 1/10 as fast as average. Now I'm going to go on the record right here on this tiny little podcast and say that I think Matt Haig read about progeria and Werner syndrome, or found out about it somehow, and saw that it's a condition that strikes just at puberty and ages people 10 times as fast, and thought, what if that, but in reverse? The book follows the main character Tom, who is a guy who appears to be in his 40s, but he was actually born in 1581, and it describes his experiences having performed with Shakespeare and known F. Scott Fitzgerald, but he also spent his whole life trying not to become an experimental subject. In the book, he even describes progeria as a syndrome and has Tom name his condition as anageria, which is the opposite of progeria. Tom, through his travels, meets another guy who has the same syndrome. This dude's called Hendrik, and Hendrik is almost 1,000 years old. Hendrik describes that after around the 6th or 7th century of life, people with anageria gain a certain enhanced sense of being able to detect people's moral character. Hendrik says that when he meets someone, he can instantly tell whether or not they're a good person and what their ulterior motives are. So I think my hypothesis here is sound. Santa, the condition, is a transmissible retrovirus that enhances DNA replication and repair by integrating into the host's genome. This has the consequence of activating latent autoimmunity genes that cause vitiligo and hypothyroidism, and, due to slow aging, gives the patient a heightened sense of perception about people's moral character. It is only transmissible very rarely, likely under conditions of stress, which is a known factor in having flare-ups of autoimmune conditions, is a known factor in making the holidays and Christmas time extra stressful, also maybe having been in one's job for a couple hundred years and wanting to find a replacement and retire. So I guess as a man, you've got to be careful in this and all future holiday seasons. Don't put on any Santa suits you see lying about on Christmas Eve. Don't shake hands with anyone trying to convince you that you're Santa, unless you want to become Santa, that is, and, then by all means, knock yourself out. And that is the end of this special holiday episode of Tierah Ruins Things with Science. Thank you so much for listening and for being here. Just remember, I am a researcher, not a doctor. Please don't take any of this as medical advice. Particularly, this episode is a little tongue-in-cheek, and it's meant for entertainment only. If you did like this episode, please subscribe and leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts if you have a moment. You can follow me on Facebook, even though I don't post there much. I'm more active on TikTok at Tierah Ruins Things. You can find all kinds of things at tierahruinsthings.com, like the show notes and a transcript for every episode, as well as reading and listening lists where I share science books and podcasts that I've been listening to and enjoy. For the episodes, I do all the research, writing, and recording. The music was written and provided by James Stratton Crawley, who also helps with editing and the occasional snarky comments and some inspiration for content. There's a link to his channels in the show notes. If you have any suggestions for TV shows or movies featuring diseases or pathogens that you'd like me to cover, send them in to tierahruinsthings@gmail.com or send me a message on TikTok or something. And I will see you all next season, which isn't too far away. Take care.